Another important fact about the Center for Art and Environment is that we exist in the Western United States. And we're here because that's where one branch of Earthworks got started. That's where there was simply enough land that was cheap enough that Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson and Walter D. Maria and Nancy Holt and other people could come make work. It wasn't the only place it was going on. I mean, Richard Long and some Brits were doing something in the United Kingdom, and there were people certainly in Germany and in Japan doing things. There were different places around the world where earthworks and land arts were beginning to develop as an idea and a discipline in the late 60s and early 1970s. But this is one that got some attention because the works were so darn big and so interesting. When I began to look at the difference between why Michael Heiser was moving earth around with bulldozers and Richard Long was moving grass around with his feet, it wasn't necessarily a philosophical difference or an aesthetic difference, could have been, but it was also simply a matter of how much money was available. Michael Heiser had a dealer in New York who was giving him money so he could lease a bulldozer. Richard Long, I mean, the country just did not have that much money to give to young artists to go out and make projects. So there were these very different means of working in the field that developed. The other thing that's interesting, I think, about land art as a larger practice, art and environment as a larger practice is, and I understand through this as well through my friends who started the study of literature and environment. Why did that start so early in the English-speaking world, and then it came later to other countries, even other English-speaking countries such as India, for example. The effect of the human footprint on the planet is so visible and so massive in the developed Northern Hemisphere Western countries that you just couldn't get away from it. You couldn't escape it. Those changes would come to Australia, to New Zealand, to South Africa, to Zimbabwe, to many countries around the world, but they wouldn't be as apparent as fast, and there wouldn't be this kind of excess money in the system to afford people to actually study that and think about it and deal with it and try to mitigate it. So I think it's a very complicated set of conditions that produce an historical circumstance where you have land art cropping up and then being studied in the Western United States or in the Western European countries. Again, the one quadrant of the planet. Now, however, we're in touch with artists in Africa and in every country in Europe and all around the Southern Hemisphere, in South America, Central America, and so forth. I really think there are people working on these issues through their art all over the planet now. There's a narrative arc that could be constructed as one history of how art and environment develops in the land that starts with the earthworks and goes up to what we now call social practice, where you have seed exchange programs, for example, as an art project in the land. And that narrative might say that human beings by the mid-20th century had the ability to move around parts of the planet with bulldozers, mechanical means, and they could shape the planet for an aesthetic reason. So they weren't building a dam, they weren't making a city, but maybe they were making a sculpture called City, Michael Heiser's current project, which he's been working on for 30 years, 40 years. So you can see where there's a simple kind of direct pleasure in saying, wow, human beings have the ability to do this. And we can, instead of moving Earth around to mine something or to grow something, we can move Earth around to make a piece of art. So you can see that as a set of voices. You can see another set of voices at the same time or very shortly thereafter saying, well, okay, but this is an age when we're supposed to sort of begin to treat the planet more gently because we really have moved around a lot of the planet. Human beings now move around more Earth than rain does on the planet. An astonishing thing. So human beings have had this huge effect on the planet. Maybe we should have art projects that are not massive moving of Earth, but are other things. So we're not going to be like Robert Smithson or Michael Heiser or Walter D. Maria, but we are going to make more ephemeral gestures. But not very long after that, by the mid-1970s, you have Helena Newton Harrison sitting at the University of California, San Diego in La Jolla, looking down at a lagoon that was dying on the Pacific Ocean and saying, how can we rescue that? How can we intervene in this situation? How can we use art to do that? Can we make sculptures? Can we make drawings? Can we make poems? And they did all of those things in a magnificent set of projects called the Lagoon Cycle, where they ended up working around the world, places like Sri Lanka, not just near San Diego. And they've gone on to have a practice that they basically, that's the beginning, one of the beginnings of eco art. Certainly in America, that's one of the beginnings. Joseph Beuys is proposing projects in Europe at the same time. I mean, so you find all of these strands developing very quickly. So the narrative isn't that you go from A to B to C to D. Maybe A, B, C, D start very next to one another, very close in time and space to one another, and develop and talk to one another as they go through. So the arc of development in the story about art and environment is not a very simple linear circumstance. It's a very, to use a quantum term, entangled circumstance. Earthworks was derived from the science fiction novel by Brian Aldiss. Was simply a nice way to say I'm making work out of Earth. Pretty straightforward. Some people began to talk about land arts as to give that kind of work, find a term that also provided room for other kinds of work where land was being used. You weren't necessarily moving Earth around to make a sculpture, but you were in some way involved with the land to make an aesthetic gesture, whether you were putting something on it or in it, or you were using the land itself to make the gesture. It had to be a larger rubric. Eco art, which again comes up very close to the same period of time when land art is being used as a word to expand eco art, and environmental art. These are words meant to describe, we're not just dealing with a physical situation, but we're dealing with a systemic situation. We're dealing with an ecology. We're dealing with feedback systems. So you do something to the Earth, and the Earth does something back, and you do something in return. And there's a bit of sophistication beginning to develop about you make an action, there will be a reaction, you will act in response to that reaction, and so forth. I hope that continues. I hope that confusion continues, because I think, again, that's part of the diversity that's a robust way to be in the world. I think the terminology can get limiting pretty quickly. It's wonderful. People still don't know. Should I call this an earthwork or a piece of land art, or is it eco art, or is it... And the greatest confusion right now for me is this term social practice, which is, I think, very problematic. All people are creative, but they're not necessarily artistic. When people do good works, it might be a creative endeavor to find a new way to get people to raise more organic food and to distribute to populations in need. That's a good work. That's a social work. If it's an artist doing that, it's not necessarily an act of art. It's a creative act, perhaps, and it's a social good. It's a social practice, but is that a piece of art? Sometimes the social practice is a piece of art, and it's pretty clear. Sometimes you can see that, but sometimes not so clear. And I also think that actually confusion is healthy. One term I'm having a problem with, and it's a term that's been around for a long time, is site-specific, particularly in terms of site-specific sculpture, because that's often how it's meant. But let's say site-specific action, artistic action. And I remember when this developed, because I was running a government funding agency for art and artists. And one of the things that we were funding was the placement of sculpture in public places. And the art community was perturbed by the fact that shopping malls and government buildings would go out and buy a pre-existing piece of sculpture and plop it down on a site. Plop art. And often the pieces were good pieces of art. It wasn't that. It's simply that there was no real relationship between the creation of that work of art, its function as a work of art, and the place in which it sat. So people began to talk about site-specific sculpture. That is, a piece that would be designed to fit in a certain site. And it would respond to, let's say it was a piece outside a government building. So it would respond to the height of the building, the setback from the sidewalk, the climate conditions. It would have to be robust enough to survive the touching of people and so forth, whatever the traffic pattern was. Site-specific. The reason I have a quarrel with it, and I've been very careful to avoid this word as I've been talking about this, is I think what we're really talking about is place-specific art. By that I mean it's not just responding to the physical environment in which these objects are placed or designed and then built in situ. What we're really talking about is what's the flow of ideas at that place? What's the flow of metaphor that makes a place? How do human beings, when they come across a piece of art, scale themselves to it, and how does that then make them feel about that place? How does a piece of art change a space to a place? To me, the word site is more about space than it is about place. It's rare we put art in space. That is, it's rare we put art into a place that's not been apprehended beforehand and already defined to some extent by human cognition. We put it into a place. So I think place-specific becomes a more interesting term. But that's part of this confusion and part of this wealth of terms that exist in the field. And just to be able to have that dialogue is an example of why it's fruitful to have the terminology be unsettled. Why is it that artists persist in romanticizing places where people do not live? And why do they want to commit art in those places? It's a very interesting question. The absolute existential condition of cognition is boundary and boundary recognition. It is between what is your skin and not. It's between what is light and dark. It is between the forest and the field, which happens to be the zone of transition where predators hunt, because that's the most fruitful place. It's at those boundaries where we hunt for information, because it's where things are not as well defined and there's something to be learned, there's something that might change there. So many artists, I think, now believe that the romantic frontier is the liminal. So they photograph the edge of cities, or they go into the alleyways, or they go into suburbs that are so bland they become mysterious. So there are all these other kinds of frontiers that I think that have developed. I think artists will always be looking for a frontier that's physical. Artists now, at the Center for Art and Environment, we are constantly in contact with and collecting materials from artists who go to Spitsbergen and go to the Antarctic and they go to Devon Island and they're working in Alaska and they're working deep in jungles and they're working in the Atacama Desert in Chile. They're going to the most extreme environments they can to find boundaries, to find limits, and to see what they can discover there. So I think that's always a push that's going to exist, whether it's in a place that's empty, a wilderness, supposedly, or a place that's liminal, a place that is in between a couple of known quantities. Robert Hughes once said about the construction of the Eiffel Tower that it was necessary and so well loved and used by Parisians because they had lost sight of the edge of their city. And you could climb up the Eiffel Tower and you could look out and you could see where the city ended and the land began. And we like that. We like to know that the city does end. The idea about returning to the land is a powerful one that, especially for people in certain social practice endeavors within this field of art and environment. It's something that comes up all the time. I mean, it's not as if Thoreau's ideas ever died, or that the hippie movement of the '60s ever died, or that the the food movement ever died. I mean, that notion of going back to the land has existed at least since the Greeks and Romans, if not the Mesopotamians. Even though the cities were small, there were people who said, I want to go back to the farm, or I want to take a break. I want to be back in nature. The idea of the hermit going into the wilderness, again, learning something by staying there, being alone and being quiet, that's always attractive to a large number of people because we like that. We like that break from civilization. We also like, I mean, the drive for that which is authentic. As the world gets more, and Alvin Toffler put his finger on when he coined this phrase, high tech, high touch. So the more technological and the more mediated reality becomes for us, the more we also have need for that which is, quote, authentic, or that which is untouched by humans, or that which is unmediated experience. So we seek out those places. And again, those places can be, sometimes those places are in, in a couloir on a mountain, high among the glaciers, but sometimes those places are alleyways in cities, which can be wilder and more dangerous than an Alp. People are always looking for that, and artists are always curious about why are we looking for that, how can I use that? So I don't know that the urge to go back to the land in reaction to urbanization, let's say, I think it's an always very complicated proposition. The most obvious one of which is, let's see, I want to live just a little farther away outside the city so the air is cleaner, and that I will be in a safer environment. It's not as dark and gritty and terrorized by people in need. That's a long-standing trend in human civilization. You look at something like Burning Man, where you have a city that lasts for 1 week of 65, 70,000 people. And there are those people who want to be in the center of the city because they want to be surrounded by everybody, and it's safe to be, you're in the middle of a very difficult desert, and then you're surrounded by people and you're safe. And there are those of us who like to live out on the edge because we want to be away from that. We want to be connected to it, we want to see it, but we want to live right on the edge of the desert, right up next to the fence that surrounds Burning Man that keeps the trash inside. So there's always going to be that push me, pull me, I think, in humans of I want to be in the city for some things, but I also want the ability to get out of the city and see something else. And artists play with that all the time. A really interesting artist for me right now is a Dutch photographer, Marie-José Hongarius, who is photographing the building, the construction of the newest polder in the Netherlands. So they're creating new land. That's a really interesting project. What does that mean? Is that wilderness that's being created? Because doesn't have buildings on it yet. No one's been there yet. It's hard. I'm not even sure that's a place. That's a building site, really, truly. But it will be a place very soon by virtue of the fact that Marie-José is photographing it. She's already helping turn it into a place. Those kinds of projects to me are very interesting. That's where the edge is exposed by the artist can teach us something we haven't seen before. If you think you know if you think you know that something is authentic, it's already not authentic because you've already mitigated it, because you perceived it and you've already transformed it in your mind. But by the same token, that is human experience, and so that's authentic too. That's what I mean. It's this kind of infinitely receiving set of mirrors. Human beings really do like to get as close as they can, however, to the unmitigated experience. It's why the sublime entrances us. It's why that story of Turner, apocryphal or not, of him lashing himself to the mast of a ship during a storm so he could know how to paint the storm. That is that's that great Western civilization story of the artist looking for the authentic. That's a legitimate and wonderful thing to do, but it can be a trap. Again, you just always have to realize there's a photographer named Mark Klett. And it took me a long time to understand what he was doing, and I was annoyed by it at first, and then I began to understand what and why he was doing it. Often he would include his shadow in his photograph. So here would be a photograph taken with a large format camera of a beautiful Western American landscape, Often it was a landscape that had been photographed by a photographer in the 19th century when it was first being explored. It might have been the first photograph, and Mark would go to that place, to that exact vantage point. He would get his lens of his camera within a cubic foot of where that lens first was 100 years earlier, 120 years earlier. And he would take a photograph, and he'd put his shadow in the photograph and be like, why would you do that? You're ruining the photograph. And Mark's answer was, I never want someone who's looking at my photographs to forget this is not the view, it's a photograph of the view. And it's a construct, and there's a frame around the view. And later he came to develop these wonderful techniques where he would make a photograph and then he would find a way of showing you what was around and outside the edge of the frame of the camera. There's a very famous photograph he would take of a bluff in Wyoming above the Green River, a very famous site of 19th century exploration. And he would take a rephotograph of the view that was first made, that maybe Thomas Moran would have painted or a photographer would have taken in the 19th century. And there would be that view. And you wouldn't realize that the view was taken from the middle of a camping ground and there were tents all around him, right behind him. But it just happened to be that that exact view excluded the idea that there were humans all around you. So he was taking an authentic photograph, but what was the nature of that authenticity? So again, it's seeing around the frame. And that's something that artists and writers are very good at if they're really clever. It's like they'll give you a true picture and they'll put you right in the middle of it. But somewhere, it's like when the Navajos would make a rug. They would always have a string that would go from the pattern of the rug, from that design, through the border to the outside of the rug. So the spirit can move in and out of the pattern, wouldn't get trapped inside the rug and get pissed off at you. There would always be that little string that you could follow in the book that would say, remember, this is a book. It's a story. It might just be something a character says about the nature of a story, and you would have that momentary, like, oh yeah, I'm reading a story, right? So instead of distracting you from an authentic narrative, all it did was give you another layer of truth to deal with. So for me, the most authentic thing is to realize that you're in a hall of mirrors.